So last week, we got us to the point of once we have an ethnically Armenian Macedonian dynasty in place at the head of Byzantium, thanks to Emperor Michael's skittish horse and Basil's very quick-witted and unscrupulous character. Once we have the Bagratid family standing firmly at the top of the heap of Armenian clans with the Mamikonians out of the way, Ashot I could receive his Byzantine crown and his caliphate recognition. But before we talk about the new kingdom, which you can see here in kind of mustard yellow in the middle, we need to go back just a step and fill in another piece. Because in addition to stability, relatively speaking, in Byzantium, under the ethnically Armenian dynasty, and disarray in the caliphate, which was also propitious for the founding of an Armenian kingdom, and a robust Armenian clan like the Bagratids who were ready to seize the moment. In addition to those things, the new kingdom also needed a visionary faith. And that visionary faith came from a Katolikos whom we actually passed over last time. He was in chronological order, and we skipped him. We mentioned Kevork Garnetsi, who toward the end of his reign was the one who had the pleasure and privilege of crowning Ashot I and being the person, therefore, to officially reestablish an Armenian kingdom after about a 450-year hiatus. But when we look at the chart of players in the column for Katolikoses, we see that in order to get to Kevork, we jumped over Zakaria Tsaketsi, who reigned 855 to 876, so a decently long reign. And he was actually the pivotal Katolikos of the century, in addition to being exactly in the middle of the century. So even though he did not live long enough to see the restoration of the Armenian kingdom, Katolikos Zakaria was instrumental in achieving the recognition that would allow Ashot to become king. Because for Zakaria, the striving for Armenian independence, on the one hand, the restoration of the kingdom, and on the other hand, for church clarity and identity, went hand in hand. For him, these were two pieces, two sides of the same thing. And it's interesting that the phenomenon that Zakaria Katolikos represents could only have happened in the mid-9th century. He was the perfect person in the perfect place at the perfect time to have a very strange and interesting career. He became Katolikos because he was capable of dealing with a situation that had nothing to do with Armenians. However, once they became involved in the situation, which was actually a situation between the Byzantine and Roman governments, Zakaria was the perfect person to make use of this situation for the benefit of Armenians. So we have to kind of go back and talk a little bit about what this issue was that the Armenians were not involved in, but then they became so. Byzantine church history in the 9th century was preoccupied with what became known later as the Photian Schism, named for this man, the holy or infamous, depending on which side of the matter you were on, Patriarch of Constantinople, Photius, aka Saint Photius I. And you can see from his very high forehead that among his other qualities, he is esteemed as an intellectual. So this schism or split that bears his name was basically, if we were going to pare it down to its essence, a conflict between Constantinople and Rome over their relative positions of authority in the church. The question between them was, which of them, who of them, is it one, is it both, has the authority to act on his own, because the hierarchs are male, we're going to use the male pronoun for it, and who, when push came to shove, would have the last authoritative word. In other words, this is an issue that doesn't really affect Armenians because Armenians don't have a pyramidal structure to their church or to their government particularly. And so Armenians would look at this issue and be somewhat baffled by why people get so enmeshed in it and so heated over it. But for both Byzantium and Rome, it did matter because there is a pyramid and there can only be one person at the top of the pyramid. So what precipitated the crisis was that for almost a millennium, the two powers had been slowly drifting apart. But all through that millennium of their gradual divergence from one another in terms of language, in terms of thought world, in terms of customs, in terms of pretty much everything, both Byzantium and Rome maintained in their own minds the pleasing fiction that they were still part of one unified, world-dominant Roman imperial structure. So even though they knew they spoke different languages, even though they knew they lived under completely different systems, they woke up one day to discover that they really had pretty much nothing in common. And no one was exactly sure when this whole idea of the one Roman Empire had ceased to exist or ceased to be true. It all kind of snuck up on them over time. You know how changes that happen over time gradually accumulate until the point where you finally go, oh, things have changed. So one sign of how complete the split between these two had become was the formation of a new empire in Europe, backed by the Pope and strategically named the Roman Empire. Later in history, people would distinguish it by calling it the Holy Roman Empire, although, as the French intellectual Voltaire once said, it's neither holy nor Roman nor an empire by that point in time. Nonetheless, by 800, it was set up on the premise, very politically incorrect premise, that since the Byzantine ruler at the time was the Empress Irene, who was quite obviously a woman, she could not possibly be the legitimate head of the one, albeit fictional, Roman Empire. And so something must be done to have a legitimate head of a legitimate Roman Empire, not a female upstart in Byzantium. So who is it going to be? Well, in 800, the very rough, very tough, very canny ringmaster of the many small political acts that made up Europe in those days was a man named Charlemagne. Thanks in part to the very excellent political advice, which he always followed, of his formidable mother, Bertha Broadfoot, and we're not quite sure whether that was intended as a compliment or not. Thanks to her, Charlemagne grew up taking very seriously his obligations. His father was also a king. Taking very, very seriously his obligation to uphold Christianity, which in Europe meant the papacy, as well as his responsibility to keep all of the political plates that were the European landscape at the time in the air so that nothing got broken, everything got done. So he was kind of the obvious candidate to head the new empire. And the story goes that he would probably have declined this honor. And so Leo III, who was the Pope of the day, surprised Charlemagne by crowning him emperor on Christmas Day 800 with this lovely bauble. How much of a surprise it really was, who knows, but that's the story. And then afterwards, they celebrated in a great banqueting hall. The measurements of it were 200 feet by 50 feet. So like half a football stadium. It was a big hall. And the Pope had had it built in advance for the occasion that he knew was upcoming. Now, all that's left today of the banqueting hall, also known as a triclinium, is the apse, which you can see here. It was saved when the rest of the building was torn down in the 18th century because configurations had changed in the Vatican. That section was no longer used. They wanted to open up the space. The result is that now this poor little apse kind of hangs out on the front of another building looking a little strange. But you can kind of imagine if you just drag that out, that structure out for another 200 feet, it would be pretty impressive. They saved the apse in part because of its mosaics. The mosaics are very iconographically important for Rome. You can see there's Christ and the disciples in the middle, but if you look to the left of the screen, you can see Christ enthroned, and kneeling in front of him are two figures. The one on the left is St. Peter, who is receiving from Christ the keys of heaven. The one on the right carrying the pennant is Constantine the Great, whom Christ is investing with the insignia of secular power. And as the flip side of this, as the counterpart to this, on the right side, you see St. Peter enthroned, and he is investing Pope Leo on the left in the yellow robe with his papal pallium, and he's investing Charlemagne on the right with the symbols of secular authority. And so Leo very astutely makes this comparison for Charlemagne, who is going to be dining under this depiction of his own equivalency and his own responsibilities that were equal to those of Constantine in the mind of the Pope, who had every reason to need Charlemagne's help. But that's a whole other story. And it's yet another one of those great papal tales that if you have a chance to read about it, please do, you'll enjoy it. From a European perspective, from the perspective of Rome, from the perspective of the Pope, the founding of this new empire was highly successful. Here's a nice close-up of the Leo and Charlemagne. Also gives you an idea of the fashion of the day. After his death, Charlemagne was revered as a saint. There are a couple of his reliquaries that are kept in the Cathedral of Aachen in Germany. And his empire was going to carry on in various guises and to various degrees until finally, and infamously, the Third Reich incorporated it into Nazi mythology of Aryan superiority. Not sure what Charlemagne would have thought of that, but it made it a very, very long-lived political phenomenon. So the establishment of a new Roman Empire may have been eminently practical and eminently successful from the point of view of the papacy, but to the Byzantines, it was a real slap in the face, especially to Irene personally, obviously. But it also made very clear to the Byzantines exactly how little importance Roman Catholicism accorded to strong women on the one hand, but even more importantly in the long term to the Byzantine system of government in general. So the foundation of the Roman Empire in 800 was like the first ingredient. We could think of ourselves as pouring into a pot the various ingredients of what's going to be a noxious brew when it's done. So we've put that in the pot. Now we're going to add another sore point, another kind of rotten vegetable, two church authority issues, one doctrinal and the other one having to do with administrative prerogatives. we're going to look first at the doctrinal issue. Obviously, as the head of the new empire, what happens in the very pious and faithful court chapel of Charlemagne is going to be picked up by everyone within his dominions. And so we're going to look for just a second. This has to do with the creed. So we're going to look just a second at the creed that we say every Sunday. And we want to look specifically at what we say concerning the Holy Spirit. So, Nicene Creed, Armenian version. We believe in the Holy Spirit, uncreated and perfect, who spoke in the law, the prophets, and the Gospels, who came down upon the river Jordan, who preached through the apostles, and who dwelt in the saints. We look at that, and to us, it's great. But it leaves out an issue. We'll come back to that issue momentarily. But I want to first compare the Armenian Creed on the Holy Spirit to the Nicene Creed of 325 on the Holy Spirit. This is what the Nicene Creed 325, promulgated by the Council of Nicaea, says about the Holy Spirit. We believe in the Holy Spirit. End of issue. End of question. So what happened? How do we get to this from this? Well, obviously, this is not going to be a class in the creed, but we do want to say that obviously the Armenians have added things that were important to them, but they are not the only people to do that. It's almost always the case that Armenians don't feel like the kind of worshipful awe towards things like the Nicene Creed that we now associate with, the Great and Holy Council of Nicaea. No, they looked at it, they practically weighed it against the issues that were in the church at the time, and then they made additions and subtractions and edited as they needed it to be. And the Armenians have added phrases that, while they're in harmony with the spirit, sorry about that, of the Council of Nicaea and with subsequent church thinking, they're very specific responses to an Armenian setting, and no one else uses them other than us. Armenians are not the only people to do this. Even the Byzantines revisited this creed in 381 at the Council of Constantinople. They edited and came up with a new creed, which they hyphenated as the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. And this obviously has come a far way from this. We believe in the Holy Spirit. 50 years later, we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life, who comes forth from the Father, who with the Father and the Son together is worshiped and glorified, who spoke through the prophets. And Armenians are signatories at this council. They know of these changes. They don't make them themselves, but they know of these changes, and they apparently agreed that they were good for the needs of the Byzantine communion at the time. Representatives from Rome were also signatories. So their needs addressed in this clause, there are others in other clauses, clearly fit issues that have come up in the Byzantine world from Nicaea to Constantinople. Now, these creeds stayed pretty much like this for 500 years. By 800, it's taken for granted. This is the creed, except in Armenia. So when people began to see this creed coming out of Rome, they were very surprised, to say the least. The Roman version of the Nicene Creed, after 800, read, "And in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life," okay, that's fine, "who comes forth from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son together is worshipped and glorified, who spoke through the prophets." Okay, everything is fine there, except the phrase at the end of the second line, who comes forth from the Father and the Son. Now, the difference is not large in terms of the number of words it involved, but it's a change. And it was a change that was officially sanctioned, not by a church council, but by Pope Leo IV, who reigned from 847 to 855. And by the time we get to the reign of Pope Nicholas, both of these men are saints in the Roman Catholic Church, who reigned from 858 to 867, and he's the direct counterpart of Zachariah and Photius. The issue of the fact that Rome had inserted on its own recognizance, something into the creed, brought into very sharp focus the question of the Pope's authority over doctrine. It didn't do this in the Armenian Church because the Armenians are not trying to get other people to say their creed. It does matter in the Byzantine and Roman world. On the one hand, Byzantium considered that ultimate authority in the church rests in the councils. In other words, in the voice of the gathered church, with Rome's bishop, of course, as a very important member of those councils. That's not what the Romans are insisting anymore. What has happened is this. Nobody in antiquity contested that Christ had conferred a special leadership role on St. Peter. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And everyone in antiquity exegeted that passage as referring to Peter. It's only later that you get other interpretations of it. Now, however, after 800, Rome was insisting that authority had been conferred by Christ only on Peter. As Bishop of Rome, and therefore his successor bishops of Rome, were the church's ultimate authority. And there's a complex and interesting argument about this if you ever decide to read up on it. So Byzantines are not having any of this, obviously. And so the Byzantine theologian Nicetas of Nicomedia had this to say about it. Nobody, after all, if the Romans are right, if they are the ultimate authority, then nobody else needs to think anymore. And in fact, nobody else has the right to think anymore. Why do we need, he says, in very sarcastic tones, a knowledge of the scriptures, or a study of literature, or the doctrinal discipline of the fathers, or the noblest achievements of the wise Greeks? He doesn't say the wise Latins. All by itself, the authority of the Roman pontiff nullifies all of these. Let him alone be bishop, master, and teacher. Let him alone, as the only good shepherd, be responsible to God for everything that has been committed to him. All of this grew out of those little words added to the creed. A question that really riled up the Byzantines in this period. It's going to eventually disturb Armenians much later. So that's the second rotten vegetable in the pot. In addition to having founded a new empire and arrogating to itself all doctrinal ultimacy, the papacy also felt that it should still be consulted regarding any change to the hierarchy of the Byzantine Church. Now, the Byzantine emperor naturally insisted that this was not the case, that it was his right to appoint and remove heads of the Byzantine Church at his own discretion. And he felt that the Church of Rome caused endless trouble by meddling, from his Byzantine point of view, in appointments and removals of bishops. And it was one of these appointments and removals of bishops that will bring Photius to the patriarchal throne. So you have the Pope telling the emperor what he can and cannot do. in terms of church things. You have the papacy claiming ultimate doctrinal authority. You have the papacy creating and supporting a new empire. You can see how this is all rather provocative from a Byzantine point of view. Now we're going to throw one other thing into this pot. We're going to throw into the pot the fact that Roman Catholics, who were fully aware of Byzantine missionizing efforts to convert the Bulgarians to Christianity, were sending missionaries of their own to undercut the Byzantine missions there. Now, ultimately, they were not successful, and Bulgaria chose its Christianity from Byzantium. But we also have things there like this. This is one of Bulgaria's oldest churches. And according to something I read about it, it was the largest church in Europe until the 16th century. This is the Basilica Pliska. And it's modeled after St. Peter's in Rome. So the Roman Catholics are putting big money behind their missionizing push. And in 2016, in fact, the Roman Catholic Church gave money to restore this basilica in honor of the 1150th anniversary of Christianity in Bulgaria. If there were a Byzantine emperor around, one would wonder what he would think of this idea. One kind of wonders what the ecumenical patriarch thought of it, but nonetheless. So you have this kind of pot of controversies over poaching in missions, over doctrinal authority, over authority of appointments. Now we're going to stir this pot with a nice big spoon. And the spoon is made up of a serious personality clash between the Byzantine Emperor Michael III, the same one that Basil is going to assassinate after kindly marrying his mistress, the Byzantine Patriarch Ignatius, and Pope Nicholas I the Great, who we saw just a minute ago in the picture on the right here. And there you have the situation that did not involve Armenia, but in which Armenians became involved. As I mentioned, it's called the Phodian Schism, and it is a full-on fight between Byzantium and Rome, gloves off, no holds barred, that began with the patriarchal reign of Photius, whom we mentioned earlier, even though by this time we've kind of forgotten him. And we should also mention that he's probably part Armenian, which might explain why he was somewhat keen to involve Armenians in his business. And there were, we're not going to go into this in detail because there were so many moves and counter moves in this kind of jockeying for supremacy that's going on in this period. So much of it was happening. Here's a nice picture of Photius listening to a dispute. He's seated on the throne. I don't know if you've found Orthodox memes yet in your wanderings through the internet, but I love Orthodox memes. They created this one as a way to describe the process of trying to remember everything about the Photian Schism long enough to put it on an exam question. Anyway, suffice to say, it was complicated. Well, interestingly, Catholicos Zachariah comes to the throne in Armenia at the exact same moment that Photius comes to the throne in Byzantium. And it's really kind of strange because they're mirror images of each other in other ways as well. Photius, when he was chosen patriarch, was a layman. He was also a brilliant scholar. I pointed out his big forehead in the picture. He was related to the Byzantine royal family, which meant that he was probably partly Armenian, as I just said. And within 1 week, he was given all the clergy ranks until on Christmas Day, he was made a bishop and was enthroned as patriarch. And so we have that nice picture of him as patriarch hearing a debate. Well, you can imagine that he was a quite contentious figure as patriarch. Unlike Photius, Zachariah was universally welcomed when he became Catholicos, and his prestige was absolutely enormous. When there was an earthquake in Ervine and Zacharias' Catholicosal palace was spared, people didn't grumble. They said, well, oh, of course, God would not touch his beloved's home. Of course, God favors this man. He's holy, he's brilliant, he's politically astute. He's everything we could dream of. Well, as soon as Photius was elected, and the two of them were seated on their thrones, it seems that a correspondence arose between Zechariah and the Byzantine Patriarch over the acceptance of Chalcedon by Armenians who were living within Byzantine territory. So he's not talking about converting Armenia proper to the Chalcedonian confession, but he is concerned to, Photius is concerned to say that the Chalcedonian Armenians who were living in the Byzantine territories, they're perfectly legitimate, everything about them is fine, and we don't want anything untoward happening, we don't want any prejudice against them, and so on. And he made a big case that since the Council of Chalcedon includes nothing that was not already said in the first three councils, there's really no logical or theological reason for the Armenians not to accept it. And here's a page from one of his letters where he's laying down a series of proof texts designed to convince Zechariah that Chalcedon's teachings are perfectly patristically sound. And I'm sure Zechariah appreciated the erudition, but he also could have said perfectly well in response, if there is nothing in Chalcedon that the first three councils didn't say, then why do we need Chalcedon? Why should we bother accepting it if it doesn't have anything else to say? Anyway, and it's interesting to compare the letters that Photius sends to Zechariah. Unfortunately, we don't have Zechariah's answers. To compare the letters to Zechariah with the letters that Photius sends to the Pope. With the Pope, he's imperious, belligerent, in your face, not with the Armenians at all. With Zechariah, he's very mild. He recognizes the apostolicity of the Armenian church. He strokes the Catholicos as being so virtuous and intelligent, which of course was true. So he has definitely got two faces, one for Byzantium's great enemy at the time and his own personal enemy, Rome, and another for people that he hopes to be able to influence, to look at him favorably, like the Armenians. And so Zechariah lets this dynamic with him and the Byzantine Patriarch play out. And finally, in 876, the last year of Zechariah's life, when the new Byzantine Emperor Basil I asked Ashot, Prince of Princes, for a crown, I'm sure that Zechariah kind of sat back in his chair and said, okay, Lord, anytime now. Everything is the way that it should be. It is now pretty much inevitable that there will be an Armenian kingdom. The Armenian church has been courted by the Byzantine church. The Armenian prince has been courted by the Macedonian dynasty. It's looking really, really good. It's almost inevitable that this thing that I have dreamed of, this new Armenian kingdom, will be realized. Had he seen that kingdom, however, Zechariah's joy might have been short-lived. When the first Bagratid king, Ashot I, died in 890, even before he was buried, what would be the downfall, weak point in the character of the Bagratid clan became all too clear quickly. There should have been no question over the succession. Ashot's son, Sumbat, should have sat on the throne instantly. But Ashot's brother, Sumbat's uncle, Abbas, contested the succession. He felt that it should be more on an Eastern model where succession goes to the brother, not to the son, as it still does in the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, for example. And there were some nasty interludes and some really unedifying intrigues before finally Abbas was forced to recognize his nephew as king. And later, as we'll see, Abbas might have realized that it was really, really, really merciful of God that he had not, in fact, become king, but we'll get there. So the royal diadem was brought to Sumbat from the caliphate by the emir of Azerbaijan, now Azerbaijan. The emir was a man named Afshin, who, in addition to bringing nice presents, was on the lookout for vulnerabilities in this new kingdom that might allow the caliphate to regain some of its authority in the region. And it didn't take him long to realize how competitive the Bagradunis were with one another, and how little any of them liked doing what any one of the others told them to. And so the wily diplomat, Afshin, began negotiations, not with King Sumbat, but with two of King Sumbat's nephews, the princes of Vaspuragan, south of Lake Van. And what he did in this case was pure political genius. Required no bloodshed whatsoever, no effort, and minimal expense. He went to these two young princes and planted in their ear such phrases as these. I see that your uncle Sumbat is king. How did that happen? Aren't the two of you at least as intelligent as he is? Aren't the two of you at least as worthy of a crown as he is? How is it that you, such promising young men, are submitting to his control? The caliphate would love to send you crowns worthy of your excellent qualities. It worked like a charm. Barely had the Armenian kingdom been reborn when, with such blandishments as these, it split into two. You can see the lighter orange, greater Armenia, in parentheses, Bagratid Armenia at the top. But at the bottom is an equally impressive swath of territory in a darker orange, the kingdom of Vaspuragan, the kingdom of the Ardzrunids. And after this split, Armenia's land soon became like a political amoeba. First there was one kingdom, then there were two kingdoms, then there's three, then there's four, then there's six, then there's ultimately 10 Armenian kingdoms. Afshin and his successors really got their money's worth out of those initial crowns. And they must have been extremely happy with the success of their policy to divide and conquer. Within this very fragmented, contentious landscape, the church, as it's starting towards the 10th century, faced questions, challenges, and conundrums, some of which were old but are coming up in new forms, some of which are new. What is the relationship between church and state is an old question for the Armenian church. It's a perennial question, it's still around today. But what do you do? What can that relationship be when there are multiple states, and not only multiple states, but multiple rival states? Does the Catholicos say negotiate a different thing with each of them? What is the status in such a situation? Second question, not entirely new, but coming up in new forms. What is the authority of the Catholicos? And on what is it based? Is it his personal character and holiness? Is it his ability to get things done? What gives him authority? Is it his ability to rally nobility and bishops to causes that he wants to represent? Is the authority of the church and the authority of the Catholicos one and the same? Is it possible to reverence the church, but not the Catholicos? Is it possible to reverence the Catholicos as a holy Christian, but not to reverence the church he represents? Again, not an entirely dead question. When it comes to ecumenical politics, how often should one turn the other cheek? What is too much bad behavior from one of our Christian brother or cousin confessions? And then lastly, and this is coming up in a new way in the new century, what is fundamental to Christianity? Since there's all of this division and all of these tensions at the top layers of things, whether it's in doctrine or whether it's in church policy, whatever it is, then what actually do or should or can all Christians have in common that kind of cuts through all of that and allows us to still have reverence, believe in, and belong to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church? The last Catholicos of the century, Hovhannes V of Drashanagert, who's shown here in an imaginary portrait, was in a way the personification of the many splits and issues of his time. And thankfully, when he was imprisoned as a hostage with movable Muslim forces, he was in a position to see what was going on in all different parts of the Armenian landscape, and he chose to record it all in detail. So we have a wonderful, it's actually sort of hard to read, it's rather violent history from him. Hovhannes reigned through a civil war between the Bagrationis and the Arjunis that resulted in King Simbat's death by beheading and crucifixion when he surrendered to the Islamic army rather than be the cause for more Armenian blood being shed by other Armenians. And his crucified body was exhibited outside the walls of Ervine. Catholicos Hovhannes, who was the eyewitness to that, also lived through the reign of Simbat's younger son, Ashot Yergat, and his relic of the cross that was his battle insignium was recently on display at the Met, and it recently went into battle in Artsakh. Ashot Yergat got his name honestly, and under him there were terribly tough years. The Byzantines gave him military aid. Revenge for his successes was taken on the ordinary people. The Byzantines helped the elite. The Muslim forces take revenge on the rest of society. And so Hovhannes Catholicos tells us about starvation, cannibalism, epidemics rampant in Armenia for several years. You can just imagine what this does to people's faith. The Catholicos Jóvenes felt that Ashot Yergat had lost his credibility as a ruler and his integrity too, because he had blinded his own father-in-law and his brother-in-law when they got in his way. And the Catholicos went to remonstrate with him and talk with him about this behavior. And the upshot of it was that they had a huge fight, and the Catholicos moved to Vaspuragan, where he found the newly built administrative center on Akhtamar waiting to receive him. Not yet the cathedral, but the administrative center. And so in a way, we understand his motivations, but in a way, the Catholicos aided and abetted the split of the long-awaited Armenian kingdom, siding with the south and its more pro-Islamic policies against the north with its pro-Byzantine orientation. And we look at this moment in history and we're tempted to sigh deeply, mourning over what might have been had Armenians stood firm as a united kingdom. But by at least two ironic twists of fate, the split of Armenia between the Bagratid North and the Argeronid South produced good things in the long term, and as we'll see next time, also in the short term. First of all, the Catholicosate that was established by Catholicos Jóvenes in his disgust and his anger at Ashot Yergat turned out to be permanent, even after the Catholicosate relocated back to the Bagratid Kingdom. And although many people hated the existence of the Catholicosate of Akhtamar and thought that it should simply disappear once it was no longer needed, and despite some very unedifying episodes in its history, the Catholicosate of Akhtamar continued to serve as the spiritual center and the voice of Armenians in the Van region until the genocide, producing many heroes and martyrs and serving as a refuge in that very often turbulent region. The second good thing to come out of the split between Bagratid North and Argeronid South, thanks to the relatively good relationship that the Argeronids had with the Muslims, Vaspuragan offered the peace and quiet needed for a flourishing of spiritual life to emerge, or in some cases to re-emerge from the shadows where it had withdrawn, around Lake Van specifically. And the spirituality of the Lake Van region is its own phenomenon. We know it best because of the clan that put their imprint on the monastery of Narek. But they were not unique. They fit into the landscape of the region. And so in preparation for our discussion of the Nareks next week, I want to offer you just a little tour of Lake Van's monastic landscape. Lake Van is nearly 74 miles long, with 270 miles of shoreline. It is the biggest lake in modern Turkey. But this does not mean in any way that it has been a stable entity. Its water level has risen and fallen and risen again over the centuries. So the Armenian town of Akhlat, not far from Van City, was fully submerged in the 19th century, emerged again in the drought of the late 20th century. What its current status is, I don't know. But you can see one century there is a town there, one century there's not a town there, then it comes back again, then it goes away again. The lake is unstable in other ways as well. It's bookended by volcanoes. Here at the western end of the lake is Mount Suphan, the dormant volcano, and there are others that are in the area as well. Here is Mount Nemrut, another volcano. And many volcanic lakes dot the landscape, as well as numerous rivers and many streams. This is a landscape that has been created by cataclysmic forces. And the landscape that's north of the lake looks like a giant took a big piece of paper and wadded it up and just dropped it in the landscape. It's very, very intense. And you can see that just travel in this area is going to be limited. Lake Van also lies at an altitude of more than 5,000 feet. So it has a harsh climate. This is not the place where you're going to find a soft and gentle spirituality. Despite the harsh climate, however, the lake is fed by underground hot springs, as well as by rivers and streams that pour into it from the mountains. And so its waters do not freeze in the harsh winter, except occasionally in the shallow southern end of it, some ice forms. As one of the world's largest endorheic lakes, that means lake without an outlet, chemical buildup in Lake Van has been significant, and so it has only one species of fish, which has been able to adapt to its very strongly saline, very carbonated, alkaline water. And the lake bottom, with a very rich, thick coating of sediment up to 1,000 feet thick, produces structures like these stromatolites, some of them as tall as 130 feet. The lake also has its own resident monster, allegedly filmed here as it emerged from the deeps of the lake, which are almost a quarter-mile below the surface. Now you have to kind of suspect when something says actual footage on it, that maybe they have a reason they want you to think that. But anyway, there are stories about Lake Van monsters that were recorded by Moses Khorenatsi. So whatever this thing is, it has a pedigree. And Van Vaspuragan is just intensely beautiful in a way that dwarfs its human inhabitants. Its spring is idyllic, even mesmerizing. And the lush vegetation of spring slides very quickly through its flowering towards the heat and dryness of summer, when the green disappears utterly, replaced by wonderful shades of brown. And then from the inhospitable summer, it slides quickly into a sub-zero, equally inhospitable winter. With its extreme environment, Lake Van and its surroundings comprise a land of many moods. Every feeling, from maybe intimidation to exaltation, can be seen in this area, painted across the sky and reflecting in the lake. And it really is no wonder that the number of words that Gregory will invent, Gregory of Nottingham, to express scent and sound and color is truly staggering. Brooding, mysterious, overwhelming landscape. This is a region of very hardy crops. The growing season is short and extreme. It's a region also of very hardy, sometimes uniquely hardy, as with these animals that are found only in this region, resilient specimens of life, as well as plentiful and unexpected migrations of birds. And many thanks to Deacon Ervine for alerting me to this phenomenon. Yes, those are flamingos on Lake Van. Lake Van is also known for the size and the resourcefulness of its cats with two colored eyes. If you own a Van cat, you need to have a pool. They like to swim, at the very least a bathtub. And it is a region of hardy people, both then and now. This somewhat changes our opinion of how Gregory of Nottingham possibly looked. He was no product of a soft environment. And these hardy people were very deeply religious. And from St. Gregory's time, monasteries flourished on all four islands in the lake. We already saw Achtamar, which, as we've said, and you can see it down at the, or up at the top of the screen, housed the Arjunid royal palace and later cathedral. But there are also Surpovanes on Gadut's Island. Gadut's means beak, and you can kind of see why the island got this name. There it is. It's pretty beaky looking. The island of Lim, which is closest to the area where St. Gregory of Nottingham probably spent his early childhood. This island is almost flat to the water, was home to the illustrious monastery of Surpkevork, which you can see early 20th century on the right, current state on the left. Parts of the church still stand. Even in a dilapidated condition, they are still impressive. The exterior must have been elegant in its day. The carving over the entrance is beautiful. Even the lake's smallest island held a tiny little monastery that was perfectly sited to have a view of Achtamar in the distance. And it wasn't just the islands. The shoreline of Lake Van was also dense with monasteries. There's a map of Armenian monastic ruins that are there's a campaign to recover them from the Turkish government that includes at least 30 monasteries in the immediate vicinity of the lake. And they range in size from the tiny little monastery of St. Yezdipuzd in its little oasis setting to Surpkevork, which is near the seaside village of Goms, to the monastery of Subtovma, nestled in its cove near the village of Altensak, to Garmaravank, in the very well-watered and beautiful valley of Gevas, not far from Narek. And the more one looks into the repertoire of Armenian ancient sites in this region, the clearer it becomes that the presence of Armenian prayer and faith around Ardronid Lake Van was as dense and as intense and as varied as the landscape itself. There was literally no spot on the lake's circumference that was uncovered by Armenian prayer. There was no spot on the lake where you would not hear the bells of a monastery church. Well, what kind of spirituality would grow organically from such a place in such a time? Next week, we're going to explore that question more. And as time permits, we're going to compare and contrast that Lake Van atmosphere of spirituality with the spirituality that also flourished at one and the same time in a different mode in the Bagratid Kingdom to the north. And so I look forward to spending time with you next week, looking at the buildings that express this spirituality and also reading some of the written expressions of that spirituality and possibly listening to some of its music.